Hi, I'm James from Future Voices podcast. In today's conversation, I'm joined by Natalie Rollock, Service Manager for Specialist Adolescent Services, Hertfordshire. Natalie brings the voice of social care in how we can safeguard adolescents and work with families. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope you do too. 20 years.
Yeah.
What's changed?
So I think what's changed is I think people are identifying things differently. I think county lines, child sexual exploitation's always been around. But we thought about children differently. Older children, as I call them older children because they are. And we kind of labelled their behaviour and what they was doing and kind of judged them for that. So there was a lot of victim blaming while they was previously. This was all going on. Like you said, 20 years ago, I know that this was happening, that people were involved in county lines. There was adults taking advantage of children, but it's more in the public's eye now. People are more aware of what's going on and people have named it. So they've put a name to what's happening, but it's been going on for ages. So I think what's changed is that we're more aware. We're more aware that there's harm outside the home. We're more aware it's not just around parental factors. There's influences that influence children's behaviour away from their parents, although there is a really thin grey line that can cross over sometimes. And because we're more aware of that, it's people are responding differently to that.
How do you support people to navigate that line that you're talking about?
I think putting the child in the middle. I think it's sometimes it's where the balance is. It's very clear when there's parental factors going on, and sometimes it might take a little while to unpick that. Is there a push factor from within the family home that is causing some of the behaviour for that child? Are we missing stuff in relation to parents? And I'm not saying we always get it right, because we could work with a child for a long period of time, because we're focusing so much on the behaviour and what's going on outside the house. We miss what might also be going on at home. So I think those really thorough, comprehensive assessments looking at all areas is what we try and motivate individuals to look at. Don't just look at the issue that's been referred in. Be curious about what else is going on, what's driving, what's motivating that child to behave in the way they are, and what's the needs behind that. And that's how we try and encourage practitioners and stuff to think in that way, rather than this is the issue, so I'm just going to look at that issue, because there's always stuff underneath that kind of pyramid. What else is going on underneath for that child right now?
It's I know you and I have had these conversations a lot over years. I was thinking about, we've worked predominantly in or with adolescents, older children. What do you think our colleagues in social care, in other areas of social work and social care, need to think about when they are working with older children?
When they've got a voice, they've got a mind of their own. It's about building relationships. It's interesting you should say that, because I was speaking to someone yesterday that said, actually, that child's you're not going to walk through that child's door that's been through so much and also been influenced by a number of different people, so have that fear, and they're just going to open up to you. So that perseverance, it takes time. They may tell you to do one, and that's putting it very nicely. But it's about building that relationship, because it's about trust, and there are so many other factors that's impacting on that child working with you, or you being able to work with that child. It's about that professional being able to engage that child, or someone else that's able to work with that child, and then you become that team around the child. So it may be the school teacher, it may be someone in the community, it might be the social worker, but just because they're not engaging with you, don't take that personally. There may be someone else that you can kind of bring into that network, who could be their parents as well, to still be working with that child.
That's so important, I think, when we're thinking around that sort of collective professional capacity, all those different people coming together to help inform the plan that might be being delivered by one or two people that have got that relationship. Is that the kind of practice that we're talking about? That's
what we're trying to drive. And it's a change, isn't it? It's a change from doing to and doing with. A lot of local authorities are looking at motivational techniques. I think that works with older children as well. It's just where you're coming from and what you kind of think has, and it is tiring. It's very, I I think it's tiring for professionals sometimes because they feel like they're not getting anywhere. So almost also having that space to reflect on what's going on for them and their own frustrations and stuff, and what's the block and the barriers for them. And sometimes it is about, actually, I'm doing all of this and it doesn't seem to be working, because you think you're holding that on your shoulders. And you're not. There should be a whole network around not only the child but also those professionals and the family as well that's trying to support this child through change.
I was thinking as you were talking, certainly like in supervisory roles that I've held when I've talked to other managers, and you can see that things are challenging in the network, and taking that time out and saying, like, where are you at with this? And then someone saying, actually, I feel completely overwhelmed. I think that everyone's looking to me for the answers and I don't know what to do. Actually having that discussion and working through that then frees people up to then be able to think a bit more. Do you find that in terms of like how we best support managers and social care staff to be able to do what you're talking about?
I think there's a lot of drive to try and do that. I think the reality is that at some times is that things are quite busy. And you need to have that space to take a step back. So I'm just thinking, for example, this week I've had a reflective space with a number of people and said, actually, we've become frustrated with each other. We need to take a step back and have a reflective session and really sit down and think about how we're working together, because I can see everyone's and naming it. You're frustrated with each other. That's why actually it's now become a us and them between a professional network.
Yeah.
And when I've reviewed, what I noticed is that we was also missing some of the information that's been shared by parents and stuff, because it's become us. So I think it becomes difficult sometimes because of resources, and people are becoming very busy. So it is sometimes having that space, and I'm lucky, unfortunately, sometimes not lucky, but when things do get escalated to me, to take that minute back just to kind of reflect, have a look what's going on, put that child right back in the middle, and then think, actually, let's look where us as social care could do things better and what we're needing from other professionals as well. I think you said to me once about, at one of the trainings actually, or it was your colleague that said it, and she said about, we put these things in place and have expectations from our partners, but actually have we said what we're expecting from them? Have we kind of put ourselves in their shoes and where they're coming from, and then working from that part? And I think that's really helpful to kind of sit down and say, where's the barriers, what's going on at the moment, and realise that sometimes we put things in place and we haven't really involved all of those people that need to be around the table, and that causes obstacles as well.
That's so true. I was thinking the first thing you were talking about, like that's that reflective space, or that space to be able to think and name what's going on between people. That's a big shift, I think, in social work practice, social care practice from when I started. And then that other thing around, we're sometimes so certain that other people should be doing a certain thing. We're so certain that the police should be doing this, or health should be doing this, or this person should be doing this. And what you're describing is being able to actually say, have I understood the agency context that person's coming from? And certainly my experience over the last few years, putting myself in another agency context has been both challenging but absolutely revolutionary in sort of shaping how I can better respond. Which is, again, I suppose comes back to what you're describing, which is, how do we not necessarily get consensus, but how do we get the network as strong as it can be around the child? One of the young people that I was talking to not long ago said, you lot just need to get all your stuff in order. It's not for me to navigate that this person's telling me this and that person's telling me that. You got to sort that out. Yeah.
And that's so true. Because can you imagine if we're creating that sense of, chaos. Chaos is probably a big word to use, but if we're creating that sense of no structure, no stability, and kind of just being really clear, what are we then projecting onto those individuals that we're working with, that we're trying to support them to navigate and change and get some stability back in their own lives as well? So I totally agree with that, and I've said that before, we need to get ourselves in order, as well as when we're challenging other people, what is it that we need to change? So being able to reflect on self is really important.
That's certainly something I've learned over my working life, is to have an openness to difference that's coming from someone else. And, you know, I was thinking before that with that certainty of, I observe across the country now that people will go in with a position and their aim is to get everybody else to agree to their position. And what they're not going in is with that curiosity and that openness to, this is where I'm at, where's everyone else at, and how do we achieve the best outcome?
Yeah.
You said earlier about a lot of the things that we're identifying in our work have most likely been existing previously, but we're better at recognising it. Are we better at responding?
I think I'm not even going to say hit miss. I think we respond really well. But it is, we need to get better. There's always development in this area. There's a lot of amazing work that's going on in different places and in the local authority that I'm working in as well. But I think you have to build those partnerships. You have to build those networks. You've got to constantly be reviewing where the gaps are. And there are still gaps. So I would say we're not where we need to be. But I think it's an improvement in terms of when I just think about some of the outcomes for children and families. I think in some spaces we still probably focus too much on the child, and we need to really be thinking about that context and where it's happening and doing the disruption around that. So different places will be doing things and developed further than others. But I really do think that you can't just, and it's some of the social work we've been taught, you can't just work on the one individual because it's a whole network. It's all connected to each other. So just focusing on that child and trying to change that child's behaviour, number one, is indicating that the issue's with the child rather than the environment that they're in, and not focusing on what's going on outside. You've just improved safety for that one child. I have in my local authority a number of vulnerable children that are going to be the next one that's exploited if we don't address that. So I think there is improvement in always areas for development, particularly if it's something that's you're just starting to work with and you're just building those networks and partnerships. But there is some really good work kind of going on at the moment that I know in my service I'm really proud of, but that's taken a long time to get to where we are now, and a lot of work we're doing to improve as well.
That's the journey actually of a lot of youth justice and adolescent services has kind of been to consider more and more around contextual factors. And I think youth justice were pretty good at recognising a lot of the factors that were in existence that sat beyond the child. But I definitely know from my practice, and I mean, you and I worked in the youth offending arm of services some years ago. And I know I worked with children that were convicted of possession with intent to supply, and I don't know if I was always alert to the fact that they were being exploited and coerced by organised criminality or older people in the way that I am now. And in what you're describing then is sort of, and then what? So then looking at that disruption, but then also looking at, well, where's that harm taking place and how's that operating, and what do we need to do with partners that maybe we'd never thought of working with before? Partners like McDonald's and partners like, parks and refuse collection and other people. And then the challenge has been, how do you create that within your system? Because if you started in your system working with youth justice children or then with targeted services, what happens then when there needs to be a strategy discussion? And what happens then when that strategy discussion decides that it's going to be a Section 47? And how's that been to essentially build a service that gives you the capacity to operate with that span so that children don't pinball around?
Challenging at times. It has been challenging at times because you're when you're working in a service that has got such a big span of work that it's completing, there is challenges to that because it increases the capacity and what people are having to deal with. That said, to be able to be in a service where, number one, remember where I was, we wasn't even working towards the working together in terms of making sure that we had the strat discussions. So it was a whole big change, a massive big change around that in terms of making sure strats were in place, making sure we're looking at exploitation as a child protection concern, and thinking about it in that way. I think it's helpful because it's a service that focuses on exploitation for children, and to be able to have the strat, to have people that think in that way and able to be having strategy discussions. There's partners that are more used to now attending those strats. I think that's been really, really helpful because, but the change from not working in that way, obviously you've got to deal with training, developing people. There's anxiety around what that's going to look like. It's a whole change of the way that you work. I wouldn't say it's a change of the way that you think. I know the people that I work with, particularly in my service, and particularly those that have been there for a period of time, they always understood that those children, they deserved a child protection response, but we just worked under a different model. So they always saw those thresholds there. So the thinking and the analysis around that, I don't think that it was any different. It's just we're in a different process now. I also think it's been helpful because it means you've got the right people around the table and the information that you need to make a decision around risk and what the needs are and kind of plan. But yeah, the impact's been quite significant because, again, like I said, you're thinking about different partners and how they respond, and it impacts on everyone. It's not just a social care or a police issue. It's like you said before, it's health, it's education, it's the community and everything. And working alongside those individuals to try and create change is a really, it's a really big task to be completing, but we're getting there. There's some really, I think it's positive that there's a lot of people that are motivated to work in that way.
What are some of the what have been some of the challenges of working to get that multi-agency response?
I think having the right protocols in place. I think I spoke to someone else the other day, and this was in a different arena. And they're quite expert in their area of work. They work around the prevent strategy and stuff, and we was just communicating with each other around that. And I said, look, we are expecting individuals that have to work with a lot. So to be specialised in an area of work. Now, within my service, that's okay because this is what we do. We work with older children. If you're looking at wider children's services, they're also dealing with care orders and other areas and they not always dealing with this area of work. You're asking them to have an expertise that they might not have. So you're talking about changing an organisational culture. You're talking about training and developing individuals from the front door right through the service to know enough to be able to respond appropriately. But they may not be the ones that, if we identify that the main concern is around harm outside the home, working with that child on a regular basis. And that's, I think that's the challenge as well. What we expect from individuals and what they're able to deliver sometimes, and then having the time to sit back and really think about, okay, what do we need to do as an organisation to improve that?
There's some key things there that you made me think of, which, unless things have changed significantly, I don't know how much we train staff around adolescence and adolescent need, adolescent development. And I don't know how much sometimes we always step out of our roles into other areas of the service to help them. Is that something that you observe?
Yeah, and I think the training's available, but the training is also training alongside everything else that they've got to kind of do. So there is a lot of work around adolescent brain development. I know my teen brain and stuff like that. There's a lot of different training around teenagers and their development and the difference that there may be in their needs. I think you're also asking for a catalogue of training for needs of also 0 to 11 and what might be around parental factors and stuff. So you've spoken to me before, James. I got frustrated where other services might not get this area of work, and then I've had to step back and be like, okay, I kind of get it, because there's areas of your work that I've had to touch on, be it court orders or stuff that I don't really want to be doing as much as I have to do. And I've said that, and I recognise that's their expertise. That's what they do on a regular basis. So I think sometimes it's about compassion for each other as well, and understanding where everyone's coming from. Not that, yes, we're all social workers, but we're social workers that sometimes function in a certain area. And someone said to me the other day, actually, having that niche or having that expertise in an area is not a bad thing, because you need people working in those areas because social work has expanded so much. We looked at harm within the home. We're now expanded so much into a different area. Some people have come into it because that's the area they want to work in.
I've seen so many different models where some people will say, actually, we just need one response to all children. And then in other areas we say, well, actually, the needs are slightly different. How we want to work with parents might be slightly different when it's extra-familial harm. So it's interesting to hear around what it is that, how we equip people to be able to feel confident to be able to work with children and work with families, particularly adolescent or older children. I think I often observe quite a lot of anxiety, quite a lot of worry. And I think some of that comes from, we don't really know exactly how to respond. And when we do put work or plans, when we do create plans, there's no guarantee that they will have an impact straight away.
Yeah.
And so people hold that. And that's what's interesting in that sort of reflective space that you create and that's in your service. Does that help?
It can help. You still hold, I think one of the things, you're still holding a lot of risk. And particularly with older children, you're still holding a lot of risk. So it's that feeling like you're not holding the risk alone is really important. And not getting into that, like I said before, at its worst, you can get into that anxiety where professionals start to blame each other and use terms that just increase the anxiety if something happens, if there was a serious case review or you're having a discussion in a meeting and you're trying to support each other. And if you're going to that extreme because you're so worried, how are you coming together with outcomes for that child that aren't based on a worry and an anxiety rather than what the needs of that child are? It almost becomes the anxiety of professionals rather than the needs of the family and the child sometimes. It does, I think it helps when you can sit back and say, right, hold on a minute, let's have a look at what's going on. But sometimes, you asked about the challenge, sometimes the biggest challenge to my work is that professional anxiety and working with professionals and having kind of coming together and just focusing on what we're trying to achieve.
How do you navigate those differences?
Normally it is a sit around the table, let's have a discussion because it's been escalated now. Just, I think, sitting back sometimes and thinking about what's going on here, what's happening. And the biggest thing for me is maintaining that child in the middle. So if I review something, I can pretty much review sometimes and have a look at stuff. And I can see that we've got to a point when this has become about the professional network and their anxieties, and we're kind of missing some things because we're so worried. But actually, what's our plan? What's our plan for that child? Because we're risk managing so much and not looking at the needs, or we just missed some key points. And I think that's just having that space for myself to sit back sometimes as well and just be open and call people around the table. It is always about that child for me. And I have to pull myself up as well and think, actually, do you know what? To be honest, as professionals, we can get into this ego, our own egos as well. We need to be really self-reflective of ourselves. And like you said, what's our agenda when we go into a meeting? But yeah, that's taken time, a lot of time.
I've certainly learned how important that is. I was thinking what you've highlighted a number of times is really understanding or working to understand what's the need that sits behind or underneath the presenting risk or the thing that everyone's worried about, so that we don't just try and shut down that bit, that we really actually have worked to understand what it is that's driving behaviour, pushing, pulling, whatever it may well be, because that's the issue that really we need to focus on. What I've learned, or what I've certainly been in the middle of, is where people are coming and they'll have a different view as to what safety or safer might look like. And then the discussion can become about which way do we go with that. And then it becomes about the relationship between the professionals. And when we scale it all back down to the bottom, what people are actually saying often is that they're really worried about the child, and we think we need a plan that keeps them safe. But the way in which they view safety is different. Certainly having experienced from a police view, when there's a push for absolute security or a push for secure accommodation. It can be, I've identified that this child isn't safe. If they're put here, they can't be harmed, and therefore they're safe. And in social care, we're also agreeing that we don't believe this child is safe, but we also recognise often that secure accommodation isn't without harm itself, and there's a balance in terms of what's proportionate and how we reach the best decision without writing them off.
Yeah.
I observe sometimes what you're saying, I think, is let's just put it all on the table and work it through.
Yeah.
And maybe go beyond the what if. Okay, so what if we did take that action? Then would this be the outcome? Would that be the outcome? And then what?
And also not the getting out of the silo working as well. Like you just said, a lot of that is about silo working, and our agency thinks this and your agency thinks that. Actually, it's not about that. This area of work is about multi-agency working, and that means building those relationships, talking to each other, and no one's view or opinion is over anyone else's.